You're standing in a boardroom in Atlanta, Georgia, on the morning of July 11th, 1985. Donald Keough, president of the Coca-Cola Company, is about to walk to a podium and deliver 3 words that will become the most famous corporate apology in American history. His voice will catch, his hands will tremble slightly, and the sentence he speaks, "We have heard you," will end 79 days of what the company will later describe as something close to a national mental breakdown. But here's what nobody tells you about that moment. Here's the part that doesn't fit the story you think you know. Those 79 days didn't destroy Coca-Cola, they saved it. The disaster everyone remembers as the greatest marketing failure of the 20th century was actually a demonstration of something far more valuable than any advertising campaign could purchase. It was proof that a brand had transcended being a product and become something closer to a secular religion. And religions, as it turns out, don't respond well to reformation. This isn't the story of how Coca-Cola made a terrible mistake. You already know that version. This is the story of how the mistake revealed something about consumer psychology that would reshape marketing forever, how a company learned it didn't actually own the thing it created, and how 79 days of corporate humiliation somehow produced the most successful product relaunch in history. And before we go deeper into this, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this story interesting, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you might think. And I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment and let me know. I love seeing how far these stories reach. The story begins not in 1985, but in 1975, in a shopping mall in Dallas, Texas, where Pepsi is setting up folding tables and conducting an experiment that will haunt Coca-Cola executives for the next decade. They call it the Pepsi Challenge. The setup is simple. 2 unmarked cups. One contains Pepsi, one contains Coca-Cola. Consumers take a sip of each and point to the one they prefer. No brands visible, no logos, just taste. And here's the thing that keeps Coca-Cola executives awake at night. People keep choosing Pepsi. Not by a small margin, by a consistent, replicable, scientifically measurable margin, roughly 55 to 45. Enough to be statistically significant, enough to be devastating. But let's pause here for a moment and understand what's really happening in these mall parking lots and supermarket aisles across America. The Pepsi Challenge isn't just a marketing stunt, it's psychological warfare conducted with paper cups and clipboard-wielding college students. The methodology is deceptively simple, but the implications are profound. Pepsi has identified a fundamental vulnerability in Coca-Cola's dominance. For decades, Coke has won on brand strength, on cultural positioning, on being synonymous with American values and global reach. But strip away the red can, remove the iconic logo, eliminate the conditioning of 100 years of advertising, and something unexpected happens. The liquid itself, divorced from its symbolic power, tells a different story. Pepsi's formula is sweeter. It has a citrus note that Coca-Cola lacks. In the context of a single sip, which is exactly how the challenge is structured, that sweetness creates an immediate positive response. The human tongue is biologically programmed to respond positively to sugar. That first sip of Pepsi delivers a quick hit of pleasurable sensation that, in a direct comparison, often edges out Coke's more complex, slightly bitter profile. What Pepsi understands, and what Coca-Cola initially dismisses, is that this methodology exploits a specific phenomenon in sensory testing. The sip test favors sweeter products because you're not experiencing the full consumption pattern. You're not drinking an entire can or bottle. You're tasting a small amount, and in that limited context, sweeter reads as better. If the test was structured differently, if participants drank full servings, if they consumed the product regularly over days or weeks, the results might be different. Some people find overly sweet beverages cloying when consumed in quantity. The complexity that makes Coca-Cola slightly less immediately appealing in a sip test might actually be an advantage in sustained consumption. But Pepsi isn't interested in testing sustained consumption. They're testing first impressions. And they're winning. The genius of the Pepsi challenge isn't just the methodology, it's the theater of it. The campaigns show real people, housewives, blue-collar workers, teenagers, expressing genuine surprise when they realize they've chosen Pepsi. The emotional beat of these commercials is revelation. The implicit message is you've been lied to. You thought Coke was better because that's what the culture told you. But your own taste buds, freed from corporate manipulation, tell the truth. It's David versus Goliath framed as a taste test. And in America in the 1970s and early 1980s, that narrative has power. This is the era of consumer advocacy, of questioning authority, of anti-establishment sentiment still lingering from the previous decade. The idea that the dominant corporation might not actually have the superior product resonates. Pepsi immediately turns these results into a massive advertising campaign. Television commercials show real consumers in real blind tests, their faces registering surprise when they realize they've chosen Pepsi over Coke. The tagline is simple and brutal. Take the Pepsi challenge. The campaign runs for years. It appears in hundreds of markets. Millions of people participate in actual taste tests or watch the commercials documenting others' experiences. And slowly, methodically, it begins to erode something Coca-Cola thought was unshakable, the assumption of superiority. For Coca-Cola, this is more than a marketing problem. It's an existential threat. The company has spent almost a century building itself into more than a beverage company. Coca-Cola isn't just a drink. It's Americana in liquid form. It's what soldiers drank in World War II. It's what appears in Norman Rockwell paintings. It's what represents the United States to the rest of the world. The company's 1971 "I'd like to buy the world a Coke" commercial is basically a hymn to global harmony with their product as the communion wafer. But none of that mythology matters if people simply prefer how Pepsi tastes. And the internal testing confirms it. Coca-Cola conducts its own blind taste tests, hoping to prove Pepsi's results are rigged or misleading. They can't. Their own research shows the same pattern. In blind conditions, removed from brand context, most consumers prefer Pepsi's sweeter profile. The company's food scientists analyze the chemistry. They break down the competing formulas molecule by molecule. They understand exactly why Pepsi performs better in sip tests: higher sugar content, different acid balance, specific flavor compounds that create immediate appeal. They can quantify the advantage with precision. What they can't figure out is how to respond. Some executives argue for counter-advertising, point out the limitations of sip tests, emphasize that Coca-Cola's formula is designed for full consumption, not single sips, highlight the complexity and sophistication of their product versus Pepsi's simple sweetness. But that strategy has a fatal flaw. It sounds defensive, it sounds like excuses, it sounds like a dominant company scrambling to explain why its product doesn't win in direct comparison. The more you argue against the validity of the test, the more you appear to be avoiding the basic question. Which one tastes better? Others suggest doubling down on brand advertising, forget about taste, compete on emotion and cultural significance. Remind people that Coca-Cola is part of American history, that it represents values beyond flavor preference, that choosing Coke is about identity, not just consumption. This strategy has merit. It's what Coca-Cola has always done well. But there's a problem with relying on it exclusively. It concedes the taste argument. It admits, implicitly, that Pepsi might taste better, but Coke means more. And that's a dangerous concession, because taste is the fundamental value proposition of a beverage. If you lose on taste, everything else becomes a rationalization for an inferior product. By the early 1980s, the market share numbers tell a brutal story. In 1972, Coca-Cola commanded 24% of the supermarket soft drink market, while Pepsi held 14%. By 1984, that gap has narrowed to 22% versus 18%. The trend line is clear. If nothing changes, Pepsi will overtake Coke within a few years. Inside Coca-Cola headquarters, the atmosphere becomes increasingly tense. Board meetings grow contentious. Executives who've spent their careers believing in the invincibility of the brand now face data suggesting that invincibility is an illusion. Market projections show scenarios where Coca-Cola becomes the number 2 cola brand in America. Unthinkable just a decade earlier, now appearing probable. The company that has defined American consumer culture for a century is losing ground to its primary competitor in the one metric that seems to matter most: which one tastes better. And this is where Roberto Goizueta enters the story. Goizueta becomes CEO of Coca-Cola in 1980, and he represents a radical departure from the company's traditional leadership. He's Cuban-born, a chemical engineer by training, and the first foreign-born CEO in the company's history. His approach is analytical, aggressive, and unsentimentally focused on results. To understand Goizueta, you need to understand where he came from and what shaped his worldview. Born in Havana in 1931 to a wealthy family with sugar plantation holdings, he grew up in privilege but also in a culture that would soon be violently transformed. He attended Yale, studied chemical engineering, and joined Coca-Cola's Cuban operation in 1954, expecting to build a comfortable career in his home country. Then Castro's revolution changed everything. In 1960, the Cuban government seized Coca-Cola's assets. Goizueta, like hundreds of thousands of other Cubans, lost everything. He fled to the United States with his family, arriving with $100 and no certainty about his future. This experience fundamentally shaped his philosophy. He understood viscerally that nothing is permanent, that institutions that seem immovable can fall, that tradition without adaptation is vulnerability, that privilege without performance is temporary. When he rose through Coca-Cola's ranks, first in technical operations, then in strategic planning, eventually to CEO, he brought that perspective with him. He looked at the company's reverence for its own history with the eyes of someone who'd seen history disrupted. He respected tradition but refused to worship it. He's famous for saying, "There are no sacred cows," or he means it literally. At Coca-Cola, where the secret formula is stored in a bank vault like a religious relic, where changing the product is treated as heresy, Goizueta sees tradition as something to be interrogated rather than worshipped. His management style is distinctive. He surrounds himself with data. He demands projections, scenarios, quantitative analysis. He's an engineer solving problems, not a guardian protecting legacies. In meetings, he asks uncomfortable questions. He challenges assumptions that have gone unchallenged for decades. He makes people defend positions they've taken for granted. This approach creates tension with the old guard, executives who've been with the company for 30 or 40 years, who remember when Coca-Cola's dominance seemed absolute, who view the brand as something close to sacred. They see Goizueta as a disruptor, possibly even a threat to the essence of what makes Coca-Cola special. But Goizueta has something the old guard doesn't: proof that change can work. In 1982, Coca-Cola launches Diet Coke. The company has resisted this for years, believing that extending the Coca-Cola name to anything other than the original product will dilute the brand. Goizueta overrules that consensus. Diet Coke launches and becomes the most successful new product introduction of the decade. Within 2 years, it's the third best-selling soft drink in America. The lesson seems clear. The Coca-Cola brand is strong enough to support innovation. Consumers aren't as fragile or tradition-bound as the old guard fears. Change is possible. So Goizueta makes a decision that will define his legacy. If Pepsi is winning on taste, Coca-Cola will change its taste. The project begins in 1984 under the code name Kansas. The secrecy is absolute. The number of people who know what's being developed is limited to a small team of food scientists, marketing executives, and senior leadership. They're not reformulating an existing product. They're attempting something that has never been done in the company's 99-year history. They're going to replace the original Coca-Cola formula. The man leading the charge is Sergio Zeman, the vice president of marketing. Zeman is brilliant, aggressive, and convinced that the Pepsi challenge represents an inflection point that requires dramatic action. He views the situation as a war, and wars demand bold tactics. Zeman is a different personality type than Goizueta, but complementary. Where Goizueta is measured and analytical, Zeman is passionate and combative. He takes the Pepsi challenge personally. He sees it as an attack that demands response, not patient strategic adjustment, but decisive counteroffensive. Born in Mexico City, educated in marketing at Columbia University, Zeman joined Coca-Cola in 1978 and quickly established himself as someone unafraid of confrontation. He's known for walking into meetings with provocative statements designed to force debate. He challenges his own team as aggressively as he challenges competitors. His fundamental belief is that marketing is warfare by other means, and in warfare, hesitation is defeat. He becomes obsessed with the taste test data. He reviews the research repeatedly, looking for flaws or alternative interpretations. He finds none. The conclusion is unavoidable. In blind testing, Pepsi wins. And if Pepsi wins on the core functional attribute of a beverage, how it tastes, then everything else Coca-Cola offers is just compensation for an inferior product. This is unacceptable to him. Not emotionally, though he does find it personally offensive, but strategically. He understands that brands can survive many things, but they can't survive being functionally inferior in their primary value proposition. You can be the less cool brand, you can be the more expensive brand, you can even be the less convenient brand, but you cannot be the brand that tastes worse when the entire point of your product is how it tastes. So he begins advocating for what most of his colleagues consider unthinkable, reformulating the core product. The research phase is extensive. Over the next year, Coca-Cola conducts approximately 200,000 taste tests. They test variations of sweetness, acidity, flavor profile. They test against the original formula. They test against Pepsi. They test in different regions, different demographics, different contexts. The scope of this research is extraordinary. They conduct tests in shopping malls and supermarkets across the country. They bring people into laboratory settings where they can control every variable. They test different serving sizes, different temperatures, different contexts of consumption. They test with heavy soda drinkers and light drinkers. They test with Coke loyalists and Pepsi preferers. They test with people who drink both and people who drink neither regularly. The food scientists working on Project Kansas occupy a laboratory space that's kept locked even from most Coca-Cola employees. They work with industrial mixers and precise measuring equipment, adjusting ratios of ingredients by fractions of percentages. They're trying to find a formula that achieves multiple objectives simultaneously, beat the original Coca-Cola in blind tests, beat Pepsi in blind tests, but still taste recognizably like Coca-Cola. This last requirement is crucial but subjective. What makes something taste like Coca-Cola? The formula is secret, known in detail to only a handful of people, but the taste is universal. Everyone knows what Coke tastes like. They might not be able to describe it precisely, but they can recognize it. The challenge is creating something new that still triggers that recognition. They experiment with hundreds of variations. Some are too sweet. Some lose the distinctive bite of the original. Some taste good but not like Coca-Cola. The testing process is iterative. Adjust the formula, produce a batch, test it, analyze results, adjust again. What emerges from this process is a formula that performs extraordinarily well in testing. It's sweeter than the original, with a smoother finish. It has less of the phosphoric acid bite that characterizes traditional Coke. In direct comparison, most people find it more immediately pleasant. And the results consistently support the same conclusion. There exists a formula that performs better than the original Coca-Cola, and it performs better than Pepsi. The new formula is sweeter, smoother, with less of the bite that characterizes traditional Coke. In blind tests, it beats the original Coke by roughly the same margin that Pepsi has been beating Coke, 55 to 45. Even more importantly, it beats Pepsi. When test participants are given 3 unmarked cups, original Coke, new formula, and Pepsi, the new formula wins by statistically significant margins across demographic groups in different regions. The data is consistent and compelling. This is the answer to the Pepsi challenge, a formula that wins on Pepsi's terms while carrying the Coca-Cola brand. The leadership team gathers to review the data. 200,000 taste tests. Statistical significance beyond question. The product performs. The strategy is sound. The market research supports the decision. These meetings happen in the boardroom on the upper floors of Coca-Cola's Atlanta headquarters, a space designed to project confidence and tradition. Wood paneling, portraits of previous executives, windows overlooking the city where Coca-Cola was born. The atmosphere is usually one of careful deliberation, but as the Project Kansas data is presented, something different emerges: excitement. For executives who've spent years watching Pepsi gain market share, who've endured countless presentations about declining performance, who've had to explain to the board why Coca-Cola is losing ground, this data represents vindication. They have an answer, they have a solution, they have a product that beats Pepsi at its own game. The presentations include detailed breakdowns of the testing methodology, demographic analysis, regional variations, competitive comparisons. Charts show the performance of the new formula against both original Coke and Pepsi across dozens of variables. The consistency of the results is remarkable. No matter how you slice the data, the conclusion is the same. The new formula wins. There's just one problem, though nobody recognizes it at the time. The taste tests were blind. Participants were choosing between unmarked cups. They were selecting based purely on flavor. They didn't know they were choosing to replace the Coca-Cola they'd been drinking their entire lives. They didn't know they were participating in the discontinuation of a nearly century-old formula. Only 30 to 40,000 of those 200,000 participants were told that the new formula would replace the original. And even among that subset, 10 to 12% said they would be upset by the change, 10 to 12%. The leadership team looks at this number and makes a calculation. Losing 10 to 12% of your customer base is unfortunate, but if you're gaining the people who currently prefer Pepsi, the math works out favorably. Besides, once people taste the new formula, once they experience the product that beats both old Coke and Pepsi in blind tests, surely they'll come around. This calculation happens in a conference room with spreadsheets and projections and quantitative models. It's rational, it's data-driven, it's exactly the kind of decision-making that modern business education teaches. Look at the numbers. Follow the research. Make the choice that the data supports. What doesn't happen in that conference room is a conversation about emotional attachment, about cultural meaning, about the difference between preference and loyalty. The models can predict market share shifts. They can't predict how it will feel to millions of people when something they've known their entire lives suddenly disappears. This is the moment where everything goes wrong, though it will take 79 days for that to become apparent. The critical error isn't the new formula itself. The error is the decision to discontinue the original. Executives debate whether to keep both products in the market simultaneously. The traditional Coca-Cola alongside the new, improved version. But the consensus among leadership is that this will create confusion. It will split the brand. It will force consumers to choose between two Coca-Colas, which seems like a strategic weakness. The debate about this question becomes heated. Some executives, particularly those who've been with the company longest, express concern about discontinuing the original formula entirely. They don't have data to support their unease, just instinct and experience. They argue for a more cautious approach, introduce the new formula alongside the old, let the market decide, see what happens. But this position loses out to the logic of decisiveness. In the worldview of Project Kansas's proponents, offering two versions looks weak. It looks uncertain. It looks like the company doesn't have confidence in its own research. If the new formula is better, and 200,000 taste tests say it is, then why hedge? Why not commit fully? There's also a practical consideration: shelf space. Retailers have limited room for soft drinks. If Coca-Cola starts offering two versions of its main product, that's 2 slots instead of 1. Pepsi doesn't have to split its shelf presence. Having 2 Cokes competing with each other while Pepsi has a unified product seems strategically disadvantageous, so they decide on a complete replacement. The original formula will be discontinued. There will be only one Coca-Cola, and it will be the new version. In the company's view, this demonstrates confidence. This is not a tentative experiment. This is Coca-Cola improving its product and moving forward decisively. On April 23, 1985, the company holds a press conference at Lincoln Center in New York City. Over 200 journalists attend. The room has the atmosphere of a major cultural event, which in a way it is. Coca-Cola is announcing something it hasn't done in 99 years. The staging of this event is elaborate. Lincoln Center is chosen specifically for its cultural gravitas. This isn't a hotel conference room or corporate auditorium. This is one of America's premier venues for arts and culture. The message is clear. What's being announced is significant enough to warrant this setting. The attendees include not just business journalists but cultural reporters, television news crews, even food critics. The invitation list was carefully constructed to ensure broad media coverage. Coca-Cola knows this story will be big. What they don't know is just how big or in what way. Roberto Goizueta takes the podium and describes the change with the certainty of a man backed by 200,000 taste tests. He calls it the surest move the company has ever made. He emphasizes the research. He talks about consumer preferences. He positions the decision as responding to what the market is telling them. His delivery is confident, almost defiant. He's not apologizing for change. He's celebrating it. He speaks about innovation, about Coca-Cola's commitment to giving consumers the best possible product, about the company's willingness to evolve rather than rest on tradition. The original formula, he announces, is being discontinued immediately. As of today, there is only one Coca-Cola, and it tastes better than the old one. The phrase, the surest move the company has ever made, will haunt him later. It's the kind of declaration that invites dramatic irony. In the moment, backed by comprehensive research and corporate consensus, it feels like appropriate confidence. In retrospect, it becomes an example of hubris before fall. The initial media coverage is largely positive. This is a bold move by an American icon. This is Coca-Cola fighting back against Pepsi with confidence. The story frames it as corporate evolution, a willingness to adapt rather than rest on past success. Television news that evening treats it as a major business story, but also with some bemused curiosity. The anchors sample new Coke on camera, offer their opinions, generally positive or neutral. Print journalists write analytical pieces about market strategy, competitive positioning, the cola wars entering a new phase. The business press particularly approves. This is exactly the kind of decisive, data-driven action that modern management theory advocates. For the first 24 hours, the company's phones receive about 1,500 calls. Most are curious, some are enthusiastic, a few are concerned, but nothing suggests catastrophe. Then something starts to happen that nobody in the company's history has prepared them for. The calls don't stop. They increase. Day 2 brings more calls than day 1. Day 3 brings more than day 2. By the end of the first week, the hotline is receiving 8,000 calls per day. The company has to hire additional staff just to answer phones. And the nature of the calls isn't curiosity. It's anger. It's grief. It's something the company psychiatrist they bring in to help monitor the situation describes as resembling the response to a death in the family. The call center becomes a theater of emotional crisis. Employees trained to handle customer service inquiries find themselves receiving calls that are more like therapy sessions. People cry on the phone. They rage, they plead, they share stories about what Coca-Cola has meant to them, about memories associated with the taste, about feeling betrayed and abandoned. One call center employee will later describe a conversation with an elderly woman who called in tears, explaining that she'd been drinking Coca-Cola since childhood, that her father had worked for a Coca-Cola bottler, that the drink was present at every significant moment of her life: births, weddings, funerals. The discontinuation felt to her like another death, another loss, in a life that had already accumulated too many. Another call was from a veteran who said he'd survived combat in Vietnam by thinking about the taste of a cold Coke waiting for him when he got home. He didn't care if the new formula tasted better in blind tests. The original was what he'd remembered during the worst moments of his life. It was what had given him hope. Taking it away felt like taking away a piece of his survival story. These aren't edge cases. These are representative samples of thousands of calls expressing similar sentiments. The emotion is real, intense, and unexpected. Nobody at Coca-Cola anticipated this kind of response. They expected some resistance from traditionalists. They didn't expect mass mourning. People aren't just saying they dislike the new taste. They're saying Coca-Cola has betrayed them. They're saying the company has stolen something that belonged to them. They're saying this feels personal. The letters start arriving. 40,000 letters over the next 2 months. Some are angry, some are pleading. Some read like breakup letters to a long-time partner who has inexplicably changed personality overnight. The letters pile up in rooms at corporate headquarters. Initially, the plan was to respond to each one individually, but the volume quickly makes that impossible. Teams of employees are assigned to read and categorize them. They create a typology of responses: angry, sad, confused, threatening legal action, pleading for reversal, offering to buy remaining stock, comparing this to other betrayals. One letter will become famous. Changing Coke is like God making the grass purple. That sentence captures something the market research failed to measure. For millions of Americans, Coca-Cola isn't a consumer preference. It's part of the landscape of reality. It's as fundamental as grass being green. You don't change it. You can't change it. Attempting to change it feels like a violation of the natural order. Other letters are more elaborate. One runs to 7 handwritten pages chronicling the writer's life through Coca-Cola experiences. First Coke at age 6, Coke on first date, Coke at wedding reception, Coke in the hospital after children were born, Coke at backyard barbecues with friends who've since died. The letter reads like a memoir where Coca-Cola is a supporting character present at every significant scene. The final paragraph asks, "How can you take away something that's been part of my whole life?" Another letter, this one typed on legal letterhead, threatens a class action lawsuit on the grounds that Coca-Cola has violated an implied contract with consumers. The legal theory is shaky, but the sentiment is revealing. The writer genuinely believes that by purchasing Coca-Cola for decades, he'd entered into a relationship where the company owed him continuity. The product couldn't just be changed unilaterally. He felt he had a stake in the decision, and nowhere is this response more intense than in the American South. Coca-Cola was invented in Atlanta, Georgia. For Southerners, Coke isn't just a beverage brand headquartered in their region. It's a symbol of regional identity. In a part of the country that spent much of the 20th century economically depressed and culturally marginalized, Coca-Cola represented something the South gave to the world. It was proof that the South mattered. It was a source of pride. To understand the Southern response, you need to understand what Coca-Cola meant in that regional context. The South, after the Civil War and through much of the 20th century, was in economic and cultural terms the country's poor relation. It was rural when the North was industrial. It was agricultural when the rest of the country was diversifying. It was marked by poverty, by defeat in war, by a legacy of slavery and segregation that made it morally suspect to much of the rest of the nation. In this context, Coca-Cola was something else. It was a Southern invention that became global. It was Southern success that nobody could deny. It was proof that the South could create something the whole world wanted. For a region nursing historical wounds and defensive about its place in American culture, Coca-Cola was a point of pride that transcended politics and history. When people in the South said Coke, they weren't just naming a beverage, they were claiming ownership of a cultural icon. They were asserting regional relevance. The drink's success was, in some symbolic way, their success. And now the company was discontinuing it. The reaction in Southern media is fierce. Local newspapers run editorials with headlines like, "The South's Drink, Betrayed," and Atlanta Company forgets its roots. Radio call-in shows are flooded with angry callers. In Atlanta itself, where Coca-Cola is the largest employer and most prominent corporate citizen, the sense of betrayal is particularly acute. A man named Gay Mullins in Seattle founds an organization called the Old Cola Drinkers of America. He files a class action lawsuit against Coca-Cola. He claims 60,000 members, though that number is probably inflated, but the media attention is real. Mullins appears on television, gives interviews, and becomes the public face of consumer resistance. Mullins is a retired businessman with a flair for publicity. He understands that he's stumbled into a cultural moment and he leverages it effectively. He frames the issue as consumer rights, as standing up to corporate power, as defending tradition against mindless change. He appears on Good Morning America, on CNN, on local news broadcasts across the country. He's articulate, passionate, and perfectly cast as the populist standing up to corporate giants. His organization produces materials, pamphlets, letterhead, membership cards that give the movement organizational legitimacy. Whether 60,000 people actually join is questionable, but the perception of mass organization matters more than the reality. Media outlets treat Old Cola Drinkers of America as a significant consumer movement, which gives it power regardless of actual membership numbers. The lawsuit he files is legally dubious but symbolically powerful. It alleges that Coca-Cola engaged in deceptive practices and violated consumer trust. It seeks to force the company to bring back the original formula. Legal experts generally agree the suit has little chance of success, but that's not really the point. The point is to maintain pressure, to keep the story in the news, to give the discontent organizational form. Grocery stores start reporting that customers are hoarding the remaining stock of original Coke. People are buying cases, filling basements, treating these cans like they're stockpiling for the end times. Black market prices for old Coke emerge. Cans that cost 50 cents are selling for $3 or more. Store managers describe scenes of panic buying. Customers call asking if there's any original Coke left. They arrive with trucks or vans to buy entire pallets. Some stores impose limits on purchases, which only increases the frenzy. Its behavior usually associated with natural disasters or supply chain crises, not soft drink reformulations. The economics of the hoarding are revealing. People are spending significant money to stockpile a product that, in some cases, they didn't even drink regularly before. The act of hoarding isn't entirely about future consumption. It's about not losing access. It's about maintaining control. It's about refusing to accept the change being forced on them. And here's the thing that makes this genuinely strange. Many of these people probably would have preferred the taste of new Coke in a blind test. The research wasn't wrong about flavor preference. What the research missed was that people don't drink Coca-Cola blind. They drink it with their eyes open. They drink it with a lifetime of associations attached. They drink it with memory and identity and meaning layered over the simple experience of taste. When you know you're drinking new Coke, when you know this is the formula that replaced the original, it tastes wrong regardless of its objective flavor profile. The knowledge changes the experience. This phenomenon has a psychological basis. Expectation powerfully influences perception, especially with sensory experiences like taste. When you believe something should taste a certain way, your brain interprets the signals from your taste buds through that filter. If you're told this is a replacement for something you loved, you're primed to find it inferior, even if, in a blind context, you might prefer it. Studies in sensory psychology have demonstrated this repeatedly. Wine that's labeled expensive tastes better than the same wine labeled cheap. Food described with appealing language tastes better than identical food with neutral description. Brand loyalty literally changes how things taste because perception isn't just about the physical stimulus, it's about interpretation, expectation, and context. Coca-Cola had spent 99 years building associations around their product. Those associations were now interfering with the ability to taste new Coke neutrally. People were tasting betrayal, disappointment, loss, emotions that affected the physical experience of flavor. Pepsi predictably treats April 23rd as a victory. Roger Enrico, Pepsi's president, declares it a company holiday. Pepsi employees get the day off. The message is clear. Coca-Cola just blinked in the cola wars. They've admitted Pepsi was right about taste all along. Enrico will later write a book about this period called The Other Guy Blinked. The title refers to Coca-Cola's decision to change formulas, which Pepsi interprets as capitulation. For a few weeks, it seems like an accurate assessment. Pepsi's advertising becomes even more aggressive. They run commercials showing Pepsi delivery trucks with banners reading "The choice of a new generation" and "We're number one now." They take out full-page newspaper ads celebrating Coca-Cola's admission that Pepsi had the superior taste. They frame the reformulation as Coca-Cola surrendering in the taste wars. The tone of this advertising is triumphant, almost to the point of gloating. Pepsi has spent decades as the underdog, the challenger brand fighting against Coca-Cola's dominance. Now, finally, they have public vindication. Coca-Cola has implicitly admitted that Pepsi was right all along. For a brief moment, Pepsi executives believe they've won. Market share data from late April and May shows Pepsi gaining ground. The narrative momentum is entirely in their favor. The media coverage focuses on Pepsi's victory and Coca-Cola's strategic miscalculation. It appears that the cola wars have reached a turning point, with Pepsi ascending and Coca-Cola in retreat. What makes the situation even more complex is the international dimension. Coca-Cola is a global brand, sold in more than 150 countries. The new Coke launch was designed as an American initiative, with plans to eventually roll out internationally if it succeeded domestically. But the American crisis creates immediate global repercussions. International markets watch the American situation with a mixture of confusion and concern. In many countries, Coca-Cola represents America itself, the taste of American culture, American confidence, American stability. Seeing the company in crisis, seeing American consumers rejecting what the company tells them is an improvement, creates doubt about the brand's judgment. Some international executives advocate for distancing their markets from the American situation. They want to make clear that the formula hasn't changed in their countries. that this is an American problem, not a global one. But corporate leadership worries this approach undermines the idea of Coca-Cola as a unified global brand. If different countries have different formulas, does it stop being Coca-Cola? In Japan, where Coca-Cola has worked hard to establish itself as both a foreign brand and a local fixture, the new Coke crisis creates particular confusion. Japanese consumers are drawn to both tradition and innovation, but they expect changes to be improvements that everyone recognizes as improvements. The idea that Americans are rejecting an objectively better product because of emotional attachment doesn't fit Japanese cultural logic. European markets respond with a mixture of amusement and vindication. For years, European intellectuals and cultural critics have portrayed American consumer culture as shallow and manipulated by marketing. The new Coke crisis seems to prove them right. Here's a company that thinks it can simply tell people what to drink, and here are consumers finally pushing back. But underneath the amusement, there's concern among European Coca-Cola executives. If the formula changes in Europe, will European consumers react the same way? Or is the American response unique to American culture, to Americans' particular relationship with brands, tradition, and national identity? Latin American markets, particularly Mexico, watch with special interest because Coca-Cola has achieved extraordinary penetration in these markets. In some Mexican communities, Coke is more accessible than clean water. The idea that this product might change, that the company might alter something so fundamental, creates anxiety even though the formula hasn't changed in these markets. The international perspective highlights something important. Coca-Cola's American crisis isn't just affecting American sales. It's damaging the brand's global reputation for stability and reliability. If Coca-Cola can make such a dramatic miscalculation in its home market, what does that say about its judgment in international markets? Some international bottlers begin asking difficult questions. If American consumer preferences can force a reversal, what about our local consumers? Do we have input into decisions that affect our markets? The new Coke crisis inadvertently reveals tensions in the global Coca-Cola system, between American headquarters and international operations, between global standardization and local adaptation. The global dimension adds urgency to finding a resolution. This isn't just an American problem anymore. Every day the crisis continues, the brand's international reputation suffers. News coverage of angry American consumers, of hoarding and protests, plays on television screens around the world. Coca-Cola, the symbol of American commercial success, looks chaotic and confused. But inside Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta, the situation is becoming critical. The calls keep coming, 8,000 per day, then more. The total will eventually reach over 400,000. The letters keep arriving. Television news keeps covering the story. Consumer groups keep organizing. Bottlers, the independent companies that actually manufacture and distribute Coke, start applying pressure. The media's role in amplifying the crisis cannot be overstated. What begins as business news quickly becomes cultural news, then human interest news, then a kind of ongoing national soap opera. Journalists recognize that the new Coke story has everything: corporate drama, consumer rebellion, emotional stakes, and the possibility of a David versus Goliath narrative. Network television news, which in 1985 still dominates how most Americans receive information, treats New Coke as a top story for weeks. Not just business segments, main evening news coverage. Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather, the most trusted voices in American journalism, are doing segments about Coca-Cola. The coverage evolves through distinct phases. Initially, it's straightforward reporting. Major corporation changes iconic product. Consumers respond. But quickly, journalists recognize the story is bigger than that. It's about American identity, about corporate power, versus consumer autonomy, about tradition versus progress. Local news stations across the country send reporters to grocery stores to interview shoppers. The footage is remarkably consistent, people expressing sadness, anger, betrayal, store managers describing the hoarding phenomenon, empty shelves where original Coke used to be. The visual imagery reinforces the narrative of loss and scarcity. Radio call-in shows become forums for venting frustration. Hosts who normally discuss politics or sports dedicate entire programs to the new Coke controversy. Callers share stories about what Coca-Cola meant to them, about memories associated with the taste, about feeling that something fundamental has been taken away. Print journalists write think pieces exploring what the crisis reveals about American culture. Some frame it as consumer power, proof that corporations can't simply dictate to consumers. Others frame it as nostalgia culture, Americans clinging to the past in an era of rapid change. Still others frame it as brand psychology, the surprising depth of emotional attachment to commercial products. The Wall Street Journal runs multiple stories analyzing the business implications. How much is the crisis costing Coca-Cola in actual revenue? What does this mean for the company's competitive position? How will Wall Street respond? The coverage is more analytical than emotional, but it reinforces the narrative that this is a significant corporate event with real financial consequences. Advertising Age, the industry trade publication, treats the crisis as the marketing story of the decade. They interview other companies about lessons learned. They publish opinion pieces from marketing experts analyzing what Coca-Cola did wrong. They speculate about whether Sergio Zeman will keep his job. The industry is watching both to understand the disaster and to feel relief that it's happening to someone else. International media coverage adds another layer. British newspapers run stories with headlines playing on American stereotypes. The idea that Americans are overly sentimental, that they're resisting change, that they've elevated a soft drink to religious status. There's mockery in some of the coverage, but also fascination. The story confirms certain views about American culture while also being undeniably compelling. The cumulative effect of this media saturation is to make the new Coke crisis feel bigger than it might otherwise be. Individual consumers who might have shrugged off the formula change see themselves reflected in news coverage as part of a movement. The media coverage validates their feelings, gives them language to express their discontent, and creates a sense of collective action. Coca-Cola's public relations department is overwhelmed. They're used to managing corporate reputation, but this is different. Every statement they make gets dissected. Every attempt to explain the research or defend the decision generates more criticism. They're losing the narrative battle comprehensively. Part of the problem is that the story is inherently more interesting from the consumer perspective than the corporate perspective. A giant corporation making a mistake based on overconfidence in research. That's a good story. Ordinary people organizing to defend tradition against corporate power. That's a better story. The narrative structure naturally favors the rebels. Some executives argue that Coca-Cola should fight back more aggressively, should use their advertising budget to make the case for new Coke directly to consumers. But others worry that would make things worse, that it would look defensive, that it would keep the story alive, that it would reinforce the perception of a corporation trying to force its will on unwilling consumers. The media coverage creates a feedback loop. More coverage generates more consumer awareness, which generates more consumer response, which generates more coverage. By the second month of the crisis, awareness of new Coke is nearly universal in America. You can't avoid the story even if you want to. It's in newspapers, on television, on radio, in casual conversation. What's particularly interesting is how the coverage shifts Coca-Cola's cultural position. Before New Coke, Coca-Cola was establishment, mainstream, almost boring in its ubiquity. The crisis makes it suddenly vulnerable, suddenly something worth fighting for. The product becomes more valued because it's threatened. The media coverage, in documenting the crisis, inadvertently demonstrates the depth of affection people feel for the brand. The bottlers are crucial to understanding what happens next. Coca-Cola sells syrup concentrate to independent bottling companies, who then carbonate it, bottle it, and distribute it to retailers. These bottlers have their own businesses, their own investments, their own relationships with retailers and consumers in their territories, and many of them are furious. The bottler system is one of the oldest and most important parts of Coca-Cola's business model. Dating back to the early 20th century, the company decided to focus on producing syrup concentrate while licensing independent businesses to handle bottling and distribution. This created a network of entrepreneurs with a direct financial stake in Coca-Cola's success, but also with independents and their own business interests. These bottlers invested millions in equipment, trucks, distribution networks, relationships with retailers. They employed thousands of people. They were often prominent businesses in their communities, particularly in smaller cities where the local Coca-Cola bottler might be one of the largest employers. And most of them had no warning about the formula change. Corporate headquarters made the decision unilaterally. Some of the largest bottlers were consulted late in the process, but the vast majority learned about new Coke at the same time as the public. Suddenly, they were expected to handle a massive transition, disposing of old inventory, receiving new product, fielding customer complaints, without adequate preparation. The financial implications were significant. Some bottlers had just invested in new equipment or expanded their operations based on demand for the original formula. Now they were facing customer resistance, potential sales declines, and being blamed by retailers and consumers for a decision they had no part in making. Bottler meetings become contentious. Regional gatherings that are usually polite business proceedings turn into angry confrontations. Bottlers demand answers. They want to know why they weren't consulted. They want to know what corporate will do to support them through the transition. They want to know if the original formula can be brought back. Some of the more powerful bottlers, those with large territories or long histories, begin making threats. They talk about breaking their contracts with Coca-Cola. They explore legal options. They discuss forming a coalition to demand reversal of the decision. Some even float the idea of continuing to produce the original formula independently, though the legal and practical obstacles to that are insurmountable. The bottler pressure is particularly important because these aren't external critics, these are partners. These are the people who actually get Coca-Cola into consumers' hands. If the bottlers revolt, the entire system collapses. Corporate can make whatever formula it wants, but if bottlers refuse to distribute it, the product doesn't reach the market. One particularly tense moment occurs at a regional bottler meeting in Charlotte, North Carolina, 3 weeks into the crisis. The gathering brings together bottlers from across the Southeast, the heartland of Coca-Cola loyalty. The corporate representatives who fly in from Atlanta expecting a routine business meeting instead walk into what one participant later describes as somewhere between an intervention and a riot. Bottlers stand up one after another to describe what's happening in their territories. Sales are down, retailers are complaining, customers are angry. Some are switching to Pepsi not because they prefer it, but as punishment for Coca-Cola's decision. Others are buying less soda entirely, as if the discontinuation of original Coke has broken their habit. One bottler from rural Georgia tells a story that captures the emotional intensity. He describes going to his regular diner for breakfast, a place he's been eating at for 20 years. The owner, a friend, refuses to speak to him. Eventually, the owner explains he feels personally betrayed. He's served Coca-Cola in his diner for 40 years. His father served it before him. And now it's gone, replaced with something his customers don't want. He blames the bottler, even though the bottler had no involvement in the decision. Another bottler talks about visiting a retirement home where he'd recently donated equipment. The administrator, previously warm and grateful, is now cold. Several of the residents have complained bitterly about the formula change. These are people in their 80s and 90s, for whom Coca-Cola has been a constant their entire lives. To them, the change isn't just a beverage reformulation, it's one more piece of their world disappearing. The corporate representatives try to present the data. They show the taste test results. They explain the strategic rationale. They talk about market share trends and competitive pressures. But the bottlers aren't interested in data from 6 months ago. They're interested in what's happening right now in their territories. And what's happening right now is a consumer rebellion that threatens their businesses. The meeting nearly breaks down entirely when one of the larger bottlers, a third-generation family business that operates in several southern states, announces they're consulting lawyers about their options. They're not making threats. Exactly, but they're making clear that they cannot continue to operate under current conditions. If corporate won't bring back the original formula, they need to explore what rights and remedies they have under their franchise agreements. This moment is critical because it represents the bottlers moving from complaint to action. They're not just expressing frustration. They're beginning to organize, to coordinate, to consider collective response. If even a significant minority of bottlers decide to take legal action or refuse to cooperate, Coca-Cola's distribution system, the infrastructure that took a century to build, could fragment. The corporate representatives leave that meeting understanding that the bottler problem isn't just about managing relationships. It's an existential threat to the company's ability to operate. You can make the best product in the world, but if you can't distribute it, you have nothing. They weren't consulted about the formula change. They weren't warned about the extent of potential backlash. And now they're the ones facing angry customers, lost sales, and demands for the return of the original product. Some bottlers begin making noise about breaking their contracts with Coca-Cola. Others threaten legal action. Back in Atlanta, the executive team receives daily reports from regional managers about bottler sentiment. The reports make for grim reading. Phrases like losing confidence in corporate leadership and questioning long-term viability of the relationship appear with concerning frequency. These aren't hot-headed reactions that will cool down over time. These are careful business people reaching conclusions about their own interests. The bottler dimension adds a layer of complexity that consumer backlash alone wouldn't create. Consumers can complain, but they're diffuse and disorganized. Bottlers are organized, legally sophisticated, and financially motivated. They have contracts that give them certain rights. They have lawyers who can articulate those rights, and they have the collective power to seriously damage Coca-Cola if they choose to exercise it. In one particularly tense internal meeting, a senior operations executive lays out the nightmare scenario. A coordinated bottler action where even 20 or 30% of franchisees refuse to distribute new Coke and demand return of the original formula. The resulting distribution gaps would be catastrophic. Retailers would drop Coca-Cola from prime shelf space. Consumers would form habits around alternative drinks. Market share would plummet not over years, but over months. This scenario, more than any amount of consumer complaints, drives home the urgency of finding a solution. The company can weather bad publicity, it can handle angry phone calls and letters. What it cannot handle is the dissolution of its distribution network. The pressure is coming from every direction: consumers, media, bottlers, even some shareholders. And inside the company, executives are starting to realize the magnitude of what they've missed. They didn't just change a formula, they discontinued a cultural institution that millions of people felt they had partial ownership of. The internal debates become intense. Some executives want to ride it out, arguing that once the noise dies down and people actually try new Coke without preconceptions, the taste test data will prove accurate. Others recognize that the backlash has reached a point where rationality is irrelevant. This is emotional. This is identity. This is about meaning, not molecules. The conference rooms at Coca-Cola headquarters become sites of tense deliberation. Executives who weeks earlier were celebrating the bold move now find themselves defending it against internal skeptics who believe disaster is approaching. The company is dividing into camps, those who believe they should stay the course and those who believe reversal is necessary. The stay the course faction argues that the backlash is temporary. They point to the taste test data, which hasn't changed. They argue that people need time to adjust, that resistance to change is natural but not permanent, that backing down now will make the company look weak and indecisive. They worry that reversing course will be seen as corporate failure, will embolden consumer activists, will establish a precedent where any change can be forced back by loud complaints. Their argument has logical merit. The data did show people preferred the new formula. It's possible that the resistance is a vocal minority amplified by media attention, not representative of the broader consumer base. Maybe most people are fine with new Coke and the complainers are just louder. Maybe given time the controversy will fade and sales will stabilize. The reversal faction argues that the damage is escalating beyond control. They point to the bottler rebellion, which threatens the entire distribution system. They note that the media story has become self-reinforcing. Every day brings new coverage of the backlash, which encourages more backlash, which generates more coverage. They worry that brand damage is occurring that will persist even if sales eventually stabilize. More fundamentally, they argue that the company has misunderstood what it's selling. The taste test data is accurate but irrelevant. People don't want a better tasting Coca-Cola. They want their Coca-Cola. The product's value isn't in its objective sensory properties, but in its familiarity, constancy, and symbolic meaning. Improving the taste actually destroys the value because it disrupts the continuity that consumers cherish. The internal debates reach a peak in early June, about 6 weeks into the crisis, at a meeting that will later be referred to simply as the Saturday session. It's held on a weekend because the situation has reached a point where normal business hours aren't sufficient. The executive team gathers at headquarters on a Saturday morning for what everyone understands will be a decisive conversation. The meeting starts at 8 in the morning and runs for nearly 12 hours. It's contentious, emotional, and unlike anything most of the participants have experienced in their corporate careers. These are people trained to be professional, controlled, data-driven, but the situation has eroded those normal restraints. Sergio Zeman, still defending the new Coke strategy, presents updated market data. He shows that while the backlash has been intense, actual sales haven't collapsed. New Coke is still selling. It's not matching the original formula's numbers, but it's not a complete disaster. He argues that given time, 6 months, a year, consumers will adjust. The noise will fade. The superior taste will win out. He's passionate in his defense, at times almost angry. He feels that reversing course now would validate every reactive, emotion-driven decision in corporate history. It would establish a precedent that any change, no matter how well researched, can be forced back by loud complaints. It would make Coca-Cola look weak, indecisive, unable to stick with its strategic convictions. But Donald Keogh counters with a different analysis. He's been reading the letters, he's been listening to recordings of the phone calls, he's been tracking the media coverage. And what he sees isn't temporary resistance that will fade. He sees genuine alienation, a breaking of emotional bonds that took generations to build. Keogh tells a story that shifts the energy in the room. He describes a letter from a woman in Alabama whose husband died 2 years ago. They used to share a Coke every evening after dinner, their ritual, their moment of quiet connection. After he died, she continued the ritual, drinking a Coke alone as a way of feeling connected to his memory. When the formula changed, she felt like she'd lost him again. The taste was wrong. The ritual was broken, the connection was severed. The room goes quiet when Keogh finishes the story. Because it captures something the market data can't. The product isn't just about taste preference. It's woven into people's lives in ways that make it almost sacred. You can't A/B test sacred. A finance executive presents projections about the cost of reversal, manufacturing adjustments, packaging changes, potential confusion in the marketplace with two products. The costs are significant but not prohibitive. The real question isn't whether they can afford to bring back the original formula, it's whether they can afford not to. Another executive raises concerns about corporate reputation. If they reverse course, won't they look foolish? Won't this become a case study in corporate failure? Won't competitors use this against them for years? But someone else points out that they're already a case study in corporate failure. The question is what kind: the company that made a mistake and stubbornly refused to admit it, or the company that made a mistake and had the humility to correct it? The second kind is actually more admirable. The conversation circles back repeatedly to one fundamental question: what is Coca-Cola actually selling? If it's selling a taste experience, then the research supports New Coke. If it's selling emotional continuity, cultural connection, and nostalgic comfort, then New Coke destroyed the value proposition by eliminating the very thing people valued. Roberto Goizueta, the man who greenlit this entire strategy, starts to understand what they've done. Later, he'll put it simply: we knew we had the best product, we didn't know we had the best brand. But in this moment, sitting in that Saturday meeting, he goes through a more complex realization. He's an engineer by training. He's built his career on analysis, on data, on rational decision-making, and all of that led to this moment, to a decision that was right on every objective metric but wrong in every way that matters. He speaks quietly, which gets everyone's attention because Goizueta doesn't normally speak quietly in meetings. He says he's been thinking about why he came to America, why he rebuilt his life here after losing everything in Cuba. It wasn't because of better products or superior research. It was because of what America represented: stability, continuity, the promise that if you worked hard, certain things would remain reliable. For millions of Americans, he says, Coca-Cola represented that same promise. It was the taste that didn't change while everything else did. By changing it, they didn't just alter a formula. They broke a promise. They told people that even this basic thing, this simple pleasure, wasn't reliable anymore. The room is silent. This isn't just corporate strategy anymore. This is personal philosophy, almost confession. Goizueta is acknowledging that in trying to make Coca-Cola more competitive, they made it less meaningful. And meaning, it turns out, is more valuable than competitive advantage. The decision crystallizes in that moment. They need to bring back the original formula, not as a marketing ploy, not as a strategic pivot, but as an acknowledgement that they got something fundamental wrong. They need to admit that their customers understood Coca-Cola better than they did. That sentence contains the entire lesson. Product and brand are not the same thing. The product is what you taste. The brand is what you feel. And Coca-Cola had spent 99 years building a brand that existed independent of, and in some ways more powerful than, the product itself. The realization is humbling for Goizueta. He's a man who prides himself on analytical rigor, on following data, on making decisions based on evidence. And the evidence supported the formula change. 200,000 taste tests don't lie. The logic was sound. But logic isn't enough when you're dealing with emotion. Data isn't enough when you're dealing with identity. Evidence isn't enough when you're dealing with meaning. Goizueta begins to see that Coca-Cola's real asset isn't the formula in the vault. It's the relationship in consumers' minds and hearts. That relationship was built over decades. It was built through advertising, through cultural presence, through simple repetition and familiarity. And it was more valuable than any taste advantage the new formula might offer. By late June, 70 days into the crisis, the decision becomes clear. They have to bring back the original formula. The question is how to do it without looking like they're admitting complete defeat, without permanently damaging the company's credibility, and without making the situation even worse. The meetings where this decision is finalized are among the most important in the company's history. The leadership team gathers to make a choice that feels, to some of them, like admitting catastrophic failure. They've been adamant that New Coke is superior. They've been defending the decision in public. They've been telling critics to give it time. Now they have to reverse course completely. The discussion centers on how to frame the reversal. Some executives want to position it as a response to consumer feedback. We listened, we heard you, we're giving you what you want. Others worry this makes the company look too reactive, too willing to be pushed around by complaints. There's debate about what to do with New Coke. Should it be discontinued entirely, or should both formulas be available? The compromise position wins. Bring back the original as the primary product. Keep New Coke available for those who prefer it. There's also discussion about timing. Some argue for immediate reversal. Every day they wait, more damage occurs. Others want to wait slightly longer to make it clear this isn't a panic decision, but a thoughtful response. The compromise is 79 days, long enough to show deliberation, short enough to limit damage. Donald Keogh, the company's president, becomes the man who will deliver the message. He's considered more approachable than Goizueta, more emotionally intuitive, better suited for the public relations aspect of what's about to happen. Keogh is an interesting counterpoint to Goizueta. Where Goizueta is analytical and data-driven, Keogh is intuitive and people-focused. He's spent his career in sales and marketing rather than technical operations. He understands consumers not through research reports but through instinct and observation. He's the kind of executive who can read a room, who can sense emotional currents that don't show up in quantitative data. He's also the kind of person who can deliver difficult messages without seeming defensive or evasive. He has a natural warmth, an emotional authenticity that will be crucial in the press conference announcing the reversal. He needs to convey that the company is listening without seeming weak, that they made a mistake without seeming incompetent, that they're responding to consumers without seeming pushed around. On July 11, 1985, exactly 79 days after New Coke launched, the company holds another press conference. The setting is again carefully chosen, though this time it's at Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta rather than New York. The message being sent is, we're coming home, we're returning to our roots. This isn't a New York media event, it's a return to where Coca-Cola began. Keogh walks to the podium. The room is packed with journalists who sense this is going to be significant. And Keogh delivers one of the most important corporate speeches of the decade. He doesn't spin it. He doesn't blame consumers for misunderstanding. He doesn't claim this was part of some master plan. He says, "We have heard you." His voice catches slightly on those words. It's a moment of genuine emotion from a corporate executive, which is rare enough to be noteworthy. He continues, explaining that the original formula will return as Coca-Cola Classic. New Coke will remain available, but the original is coming back. The pause after "we have heard you" is brief but significant. For a moment, Keogh's composure wavers. It's not dramatic, he's not breaking down, but it's visible. His voice drops slightly. He looks directly at the cameras rather than at his notes. It's clear this isn't just a corporate statement being read. It's an acknowledgement of failure, of mistake, of having gotten something fundamentally wrong. The journalists in the room sense the moment. This isn't the usual corporate press conference where executives present carefully constructed messages designed to manage perceptions. This is something closer to an apology, though Keogh never uses that word. It's an admission that the company was wrong and the consumers were right. Then he says something that will become almost as famous as the crisis itself. Some critics will say Coca-Cola made a marketing mistake. Some cynics will say that we planned the whole thing. The truth is, we are not that dumb and we are not that smart. And that line is crucial because it addresses what will become one of the most persistent conspiracy theories about this entire event. The line gets laughs from the journalists, which is Keogh's intention. It breaks the tension. It humanizes the company. It acknowledges both the magnitude of the mistake and the absurdity of thinking it could have been deliberate. It's a perfect example of rhetorical skill, using humor to diffuse criticism while making a serious point. The rest of the press conference involves logistics. When Classic Coke will return to stores, what will happen with new Coke, how bottlers are responding, but those details are secondary to the main message, which is simple and profound. We were wrong, you were right, we're fixing it. Did Coca-Cola do this on purpose? Did they create a crisis deliberately, knowing they would bring back the original formula to massive goodwill and free publicity? Was the greatest marketing disaster of the 20th century actually the greatest marketing success? The conspiracy theory is compelling because the outcome is so positive. When Coca-Cola Classic returns, sales don't just recover, they surge. The combination of Classic and New Coke gives Coca-Cola more total market share than it had before the crisis began. The brand receives more media attention than any advertising campaign could buy. Consumer loyalty is demonstrated and strengthened rather than damaged. It's such a perfect result that it seems impossible it could be accidental. But all available evidence suggests it was. The company's internal documents show genuine panic during those 79 days. The stock price dipped. Executives were genuinely worried about bottler rebellions and long-term brand damage. The decision to bring back the original wasn't made until late June, meaning they endured 2 full months of crisis before committing to reversal. Interviews with executives involved, conducted years later when they no longer had reason to maintain a cover story, consistently described confusion, stress, and genuine surprise at the intensity of the backlash. They described sleepless nights, tense meetings, real fear that the brand was suffering permanent damage. The financial data supports this. Coca-Cola's stock price dropped during the crisis. Market analysts were downgrading the company's outlook. If this was a planned event, the company endured real financial consequences for the sake of the plan. The bottler rebellion was particularly difficult to fake. These were independent business owners with their own financial interests. Their anger and threats were documented in letters, in meetings, in legal consultations. Either they were all in on an elaborate deception which strains credibility, or their anger was real. If this was planned, it was planned so deep that even most of the company's own executives didn't know it, which strains credibility. The more likely explanation is simpler and more interesting. Coca-Cola made a massive mistake that accidentally revealed and strengthened the very thing they were worried about losing. They were afraid consumer loyalty was eroding because Pepsi tasted better. What they discovered is that consumer loyalty had nothing to do with taste. The loyalty was emotional, cultural, almost tribal, and by threatening to take away the original formula, they forced consumers to confront and articulate how much they cared. The crisis became a demonstration of brand equity more powerful than any market research could measure. This is the genuine insight that emerges from the experience. Before April 1985, Coca-Cola knew it had strong brand loyalty based on market share and consumer surveys. But loyalty is an abstract concept. It's easy to say you're loyal to a brand when nothing challenges that loyalty. The real test comes when something you claim to value is threatened. Do you shrug and accept the change, or do you fight? Millions of consumers fought. They fought with phone calls, letters, organized protests, legal threats, hoarding behavior, media advocacy. They fought harder than Coca-Cola executives thought possible, harder than any market research predicted, harder than made rational sense, given that the new formula arguably tasted better. And in fighting, they proved that their loyalty wasn't conditional on objective product superiority. It was deeper, more emotional, more tied to identity and meaning. They weren't defending a beverage, they were defending a piece of their lives. When ABC News interrupts the soap opera General Hospital to announce the return of Coca-Cola Classic, you understand how deeply this story has penetrated American culture. This isn't just business news. This is being treated as a cultural event worth interrupting scheduled programming. The decision to interrupt programming for the announcement is extraordinary. Television networks don't interrupt scheduled content lightly. It usually requires major breaking news, political crises, natural disasters, events of national importance. That ABC deemed the return of Coca-Cola Classic worthy of interrupting General Hospital, one of the most popular shows on television, indicates how completely the new Coke story had captured public attention. The announcement itself is brief. A news anchor appears on screen, says that Coca-Cola has announced it's bringing back the original formula, provides a few details, then returns viewers to their program. The whole interruption lasts maybe 90 seconds. But it's those 90 seconds that matter. The network has decided this news can't wait for the next scheduled news broadcast. Viewers need to know now. And the sales numbers prove it wasn't hype. Combined sales of Classic and New Coke surge past previous levels. Coca-Cola recaptures market share from Pepsi. The trend line that looked so threatening in 1984 reverses. The market response to Classic Coke's return is immediate and dramatic. Stores report customers cheering when they see Classic Coke on shelves. People buy multiple cases in the first week, even though there's no longer a scarcity threat. It's not hoarding this time, it's celebration. Sales data from the summer of 1985 shows Classic Coke dramatically outperforming any projections. The combination of returning customers and new interest driven by the publicity creates a surge that exceeds what the original formula had been achieving before the change. New Coke, still available, captures a small percentage of sales, but nothing close to what projections had suggested. More significantly, total Coca-Cola product sales, Classic plus New Coke combined, exceed what original Coke alone had been selling before April. The company has gained market share despite, or perhaps because of, the crisis. Roger Enrico's book, The Other Guy Blinked, comes out in 1986, still treating this as a Pepsi victory. But the market data tells a different story. If Pepsi won, it was a Pyrrhic victory. Coca-Cola emerges stronger. The book is interesting as a historical document because it captures Pepsi's perspective at a moment when they still believed they'd won. Enrico writes with confidence about Pepsi's strategic victory, about Coca-Cola's admission of inferiority, about the cola wars entering a new phase with Pepsi ascendant. But even as the book is being written and published, the market reality is showing something different. Coca-Cola's recovery isn't just a recovery, it's a surge. The publicity around the crisis and reversal has raised the profile of Coca-Cola more than any advertising campaign could have. People who hadn't thought about cola preference in years are now intensely aware of their loyalty to Coca-Cola. New Coke continues to exist for years, though its market share declines steadily. In 1992, it's renamed Coke Stew, but that doesn't help. By 2002, it's quietly discontinued. Almost nobody notices. The entire experiment becomes a historical footnote to the crisis and reversal. What persists is the lesson. Business schools immediately incorporate the new Coke crisis into their curricula. It becomes one of the most studied marketing cases in history. Harvard writes a case study. Every marketing textbook includes it. If you take an MBA program anywhere in the world, you will discuss what Coca-Cola did wrong and what they did right in response. The case study approach varies by institution. Some focus on the research methodology, asking whether the taste tests were properly designed. Some examine the decision-making process, looking at how organizational consensus formed around a flawed strategy. Some focus on the crisis response, analyzing how Coca-Cola managed the reversal. Some look at brand theory, using the case to illustrate the difference between product attributes and brand equity. But regardless of pedagogical approach, the case is ubiquitous. It's become shorthand for certain types of business mistakes, ignoring emotional attachment, over-relying on quantitative data, failing to understand what you're really selling. Professors can simply say, "Remember new Coke," and students understand the reference and the implied lesson. The lessons taught are multiple and profound. First, brand equity is real and measurable. Even if you can't measure it with taste tests, the value of a brand exists partially in the product, but substantially in the meaning consumers attach to it. That meaning can exceed the functional value by orders of magnitude. Second, consumers develop a sense of ownership over brands they love. They're not just customers, they're stakeholders in a psychological sense. They feel entitled to protect the brand from changes they disagree with, even changes that might objectively improve the product. Third, quantitative research has limits. You can test taste, you can measure preference, but you can't measure emotional attachment, cultural significance, or identity value with blind taste tests and focus groups. Some things only reveal themselves when threatened. Fourth, how you respond to a crisis matters as much as avoiding the crisis. Coca-Cola's decision to acknowledge the mistake quickly and publicly, to reverse course without equivocating, turned a disaster into a redemption story. They could have stubbornly insisted consumers were wrong. They could have blamed the media or activists. Instead, they said, "We heard you," and brought back what people wanted. Fifth, consumer power is real. This was demonstrated dramatically in an era before social media, before viral campaigns, before hashtags. Imagine what would happen today. The new Coke crisis showed that even the most powerful brand in the world couldn't force consumers to accept a change they fundamentally rejected. But there's a deeper lesson that often gets missed in the business school analysis. The crisis revealed that Coca-Cola wasn't selling a beverage, they were selling continuity. Think about what Coca-Cola represented to the people who were most upset. For many, it was something their parents drank, something their grandparents drank. It was a constant in a changing world. The taste wasn't the point. The constancy was the point. In an era of rapid technological change, social upheaval, economic anxiety, all of which characterized the 1980s, Coca-Cola was something you could rely on to stay the same. It was part of your childhood and your adulthood. It was there at celebrations and ordinary moments. It was familiar. And familiarity, it turns out, has enormous value. When Coca-Cola announced they were changing the formula, they weren't just altering a product, they were breaking a contract with continuity. They were saying that even this basic thing you thought was permanent, is subject to change. That's why people compared it to grief. Grief isn't just sadness, grief is the response to loss. And what consumers felt they lost wasn't access to a particular flavor. They lost the guarantee that some things would remain constant. This explains why the blind taste tests were so misleading. In a blind test, you're evaluating a product. In real life, you're experiencing a relationship. It's the same reason why you might prefer a new restaurant objectively, but still miss the old one. The old one had history, the new one just has food. Roberto Goizueta, to his credit, understood this once it became clear. He took full responsibility for the decision. He didn't blame his team or the research. He acknowledged that they missed something fundamental about their own brand, and he remained CEO until his death in 1997. The new Coke crisis didn't end his career. If anything, his willingness to admit the mistake and reverse course demonstrated leadership qualities that made the company stronger. Under his continued leadership, Coca-Cola expanded globally, introduced successful new products, and grew shareholder value dramatically. The New Coke episode became a temporary setback in what was overall a highly successful tenure. His obituaries in 1997 mention New Coke, but primarily celebrated his strategic vision and business acumen. Sergio Zeman, the marketing VP who architected the New Coke strategy, left the company not long after the reversal, but he returned in 1993 as Chief Marketing Officer and went on to write books about marketing strategy, including one titled The End of Marketing as We Know It. Zeman's departure in the late 1980s was framed as mutual decision, but it was clearly related to the New Coke failure. He'd been the most visible advocate for the change, the most aggressive in defending it, the most confident in its success. When it failed, he became a convenient focal point for blame. His return in 1993 is interesting because it suggests that Goizueta and other Coca-Cola leadership recognized that Zeman's strategic thinking was valuable despite the New Coke mistake. He returned at a time when the company was facing new challenges from rival brands and needed aggressive, innovative marketing leadership. The irony is that the New Coke experience probably made him a better marketer. He learned something that can't be taught in business school. Emotional attachment is more powerful than product features. His books, written after both his departure and return, reflect someone who deeply internalized the lessons of the experience. He writes about the limits of research, about understanding consumers emotionally rather than just analytically, about the difference between what people say and what they feel. It's wisdom earned through failure. For decades after 1985, whenever a major company attempted to change a beloved product, the first question asked was, "Is this another New Coke?" The phrase became shorthand for corporate tone deafness, for misreading your customer base, for fixing something that isn't broken. But that interpretation misses something important. New Coke wasn't broken thinking. It was incomplete thinking. The research was sound. The product testing was extensive. The strategic logic was coherent. What was missing was an understanding that they weren't just selling to taste buds. They were selling to memory, identity, and emotion. And here's the thing about emotions. You can't A/B test them. You can test whether someone prefers a sweeter or less sweet formula. You can't test whether they'll feel betrayed when you take away the formula they grew up with. That's a different category of human experience. The psychiatrist Coca-Cola, hired to help handle the crisis, said something revealing about the nature of the calls they received. Many people weren't just angry, they were expressing genuine sadness. They talked about Coke as part of their family traditions. They described specific memories, drinking it after Little League games, having it at picnics, sharing it with people who had died. The product had become woven into the fabric of their lives in ways that transcended its function as a soft drink. This is what great brands do. They stop being products and become parts of identity and memory. They achieve a psychological status where attacking the brand feels like attacking the person. Apple users experience this. Sports team fans experience this. People who identify strongly with particular cars, particular clothing brands, particular anything, understand this phenomenon. Coca-Cola had achieved this status so thoroughly that they didn't even realize it. They thought they were selling a beverage. They were actually selling something closer to a secular sacrament. And when you change the communion wafer, people notice. The religious metaphor isn't accidental. The language people used to describe their attachment to Coca-Cola often had religious or quasi-religious overtones. It was part of rituals. It had symbolic significance. It connected people across time and geography. It represented values, Americana, tradition, simple pleasures, that felt meaningful. This is why the Southern response was so intense. In the South, Coca-Cola wasn't just a company headquartered locally. It was proof that the South contributed something valuable to American culture. Taking away the original formula felt like erasing that contribution. Understanding this helps explain why the reversal was so successful. Coca-Cola didn't just bring back a product. They validated the emotions of millions of people who felt dismissed. They acknowledged that consumer attachment mattered more than market research. They demonstrated humility, which is rare enough in corporate culture to be noteworthy. And consumers responded with loyalty even stronger than before. This is the paradox at the heart of the entire story. The company makes what appears to be a catastrophic mistake. The mistake forces consumers to articulate how much they care. The company listens and reverses course. The result is a stronger emotional bond than existed before the crisis. It's almost like relationship counseling on a corporate scale. Sometimes you don't know how much something matters until it's threatened. Sometimes the fight actually strengthens the relationship. Of course, this only works if you actually reverse course. If Coca-Cola had stubbornly stuck with New Coke, insisting consumers would eventually accept it, the outcome would have been completely different. The crisis would have become permanent damage. The speed of the reversal was crucial. 79 days is long enough to demonstrate that you took the original decision seriously, short enough to prevent permanent defection to competitors. Any longer, and you risk consumers forming new habits. Any shorter, and you look impulsive rather than responsive. It's also worth noting that New Coke wasn't discontinued immediately. It remained available for years, eventually as Coke 2. This meant people who actually preferred it, and some did, could still choose it. But making the original formula the default product acknowledged what the market was screaming. Most people wanted the Coke they grew up with. The whole episode demonstrates something important about innovation and tradition in consumer markets. Innovation isn't always progress. Sometimes what consumers value most is consistency. The assumption that newer equals better, that improvement equals success, that change demonstrates vitality. These are business assumptions that don't always map onto consumer psychology. People want some things to change and improve. Computers, phones, cars, medical treatments. Bring on the innovation. But other things are valued specifically because they don't change. They're anchors in a chaotic world. Knowing which category your product falls into is essential. Coca-Cola learned they were in the anchor category, not because their product couldn't be improved in objective terms, but because the improvement wasn't what consumers valued. They valued the constancy. This has implications far beyond soft drinks. Think about other brands that have faced backlash for changes. Instagram altering its feed algorithm, Twitter changing its character limit, Reddit redesigning its interface, Facebook constantly modifying its layout. The consumer response is often anger, nostalgia, demands to bring back the old version. These aren't always cases where the old version was objectively better. Sometimes the new version has clear improvements, but users have relationships with the old version. They've learned its quirks. They've adapted their behavior around it. Change requires relearning, which is friction, which feels like loss. Smart companies understand this. They grandfather old users into legacy versions, or they make changes gradually, or they provide clear benefits that outweigh the adjustment cost. Dumb companies do what Coca-Cola did in 1985, assume that because their metrics show improvement, consumers will automatically accept change. The difference between smart and dumb isn't intelligence, it's empathy. It's understanding that your customers are humans with emotions, not rational utility maximizers who make choices based purely on objective product features. Coca-Cola, to their credit, learned this lesson and never forgot it. Since 1985, the company has introduced dozens of new products: Diet Coke, Cherry Coke, Vanilla Coke, Coke Zero, countless limited editions and regional variations, but they've never again discontinued the original formula. It remains available as Coca-Cola Classic, and eventually the Classic label was dropped because it was clear the original was simply the default. The brand extensions work because they're additions, not replacements. You can choose Vanilla Coke if you want something different, but regular Coke is still there if you want the familiar version. Nobody feels like something is being taken away. This is the strategic shift that emerged from the crisis: innovation through addition rather than substitution. It seems obvious in retrospect, but it took the near disaster of 1985 to make it obvious to one of the most sophisticated marketing organizations in the world. And here's the final irony: Pepsi, which appeared to win the battle in April 1985, ultimately lost the war. Roger Enrico's victory lap in The Other Guy Blinked looks premature when you examine the market share data from 1985 onward. Coca-Cola's combined products, Classic and New Coke together, outsold Pepsi's offerings. More importantly, the emotional intensity of consumer loyalty to Coca-Cola, now demonstrated publicly and dramatically, made it harder for Pepsi to gain ground. Pepsi won a taste test. Coca-Cola won the brand war. The Pepsi challenge continued for years after 1985, but it never had the same impact. Consumers had already answered a more important question than which tastes better. They'd answered which one matters more, and the answer was clearly Coke. Pepsi's fundamental strategic problem was that they tried to compete on taste when the competition was actually about meaning. They thought they were in a product war when it was actually a culture war. This is a common mistake in competitive strategy. You assume your competitor's advantage is in the domain where you're trying to compete. Sometimes their advantage is in a completely different domain that you're not even measuring. Coca-Cola's advantage wasn't taste, it was emotional resonance, cultural embeddedness, and historical continuity. Pepsi could win every blind taste test ever conducted and still not overcome those advantages. The New Coke crisis revealed this in a way that no amount of market research ever could. So what's the final assessment of those 79 days? Was it a disaster? Objectively, yeah. The company nearly fractured its relationship with consumers, bottlers, and shareholders. It generated massive negative publicity. It created a crisis where none needed to exist. Was it a success? In outcome, paradoxically, yes. Sales increased, brand loyalty strengthened, market share recovered. The company learned lessons that informed strategy for decades. Was it planned? Almost certainly not. The weight of evidence suggests genuine corporate miscalculation followed by effective crisis response. Was it instructive? Absolutely. It studied more than almost any other marketing case because it reveals fundamental truths about branding, consumer psychology, and the limits of quantitative research. Donald Keogh's line, "We are not that dumb and we are not that smart," captures this perfectly. They weren't dumb enough to intentionally create a crisis. They weren't smart enough to predict the response. But they were smart enough to recognize the mistake and humble enough to admit it publicly. That combination of confidence and humility is rare in corporate culture. Usually companies either stubbornly defend bad decisions or quietly reverse them while claiming nothing went wrong. Coca-Cola did neither. They said clearly, "We were wrong, you were right, we're bringing back what you want." And that honesty, more than any marketing campaign, built trust. This is the part that often gets lost in business school analysis. The crisis wasn't just about product and market share, it was about trust. Consumers felt betrayed not just because the formula changed, but because they weren't consulted. They felt ownership of the brand that wasn't being respected. By reversing course and explicitly saying, "We heard you," Coca-Cola restored that trust. They acknowledged consumer ownership. They validated the emotions. This is why the relationship got stronger rather than weaker. The crisis and resolution demonstrated that the company would listen, which is exactly what consumers wanted to know. It's like the difference between a relationship that never has conflict and a relationship that has conflict but resolves it well. The second kind is often stronger because it's proven it can survive stress. Coca-Cola's relationship with consumers survived the stress of New Coke. That survival proved the relationship was real, not just transactional, and that's worth more than any taste test victory. There's one more angle worth exploring, what New Coke says about American culture in the 1980s. The decade is often characterized as obsessed with innovation, progress, aggressive capitalism, and the future. Reagan is talking about morning in America. Technology is accelerating, everything is supposed to be getting better, faster, newer. And then the most successful company in American capitalism tries to improve its core product, and millions of people reject the improvement in favor of tradition. That tension between progress and continuity, between innovation and nostalgia, is fundamental to understanding the 1980s. The decade simultaneously wanted to move forward and hold on to what it knew. Coca-Cola got caught in that tension. The company's leadership represented the progressive side. They saw market data suggesting they were losing ground. They developed a solution based on research and testing. They implemented change decisively. This was textbook business strategy, but consumers represented the conservative side. They didn't want change. They wanted the familiar. They wanted the taste their parents and grandparents drank. They wanted continuity with the past. Neither side was wrong. They were just optimizing for different values. The company was optimizing for market share. Consumers were optimizing for emotional security. The crisis happened because the company didn't realize consumers were optimizing for something different than what the company was measuring. Once they understood that, the solution became obvious. Give consumers what they're actually asking for, not what you think they should want based on blind taste tests. This is a lesson that extends far beyond soft drinks or marketing. It applies to politics, where leaders often try to implement policies they believe are objectively better while voters resist because the policies threaten their sense of identity or continuity. It applies to technology, where engineers build features they think improve products while users complain about forced changes to interfaces they'd learned. It applies to culture, where institutions try to modernize or progress while communities push back to preserve traditions they value. The fundamental pattern is the same. Experts or leaders believe they're improving something based on objective metrics, while the people actually using or experiencing the thing value different qualities than what's being measured. New Coke is the perfect case study of this dynamic because the metrics were solid, the taste tests weren't flawed, the research was extensive, the logic was sound. And it still failed completely because it measured the wrong thing. What should have been measured wasn't taste preference. It was attachment intensity, it was identity significance, it was emotional investment. But those things are much harder to measure. They don't fit neatly into the kind of quantitative research that produces the reassuring certainty of 200,000 taste tests. And that's the real lesson for anyone making decisions that affect people. The most important things are often the hardest to measure. You can measure taste. You can't easily measure how much someone will miss the taste they're used to. You can measure preference. You can't easily measure emotional attachment. You can measure satisfaction. You can't easily measure identity. The things that matter most are often invisible to the tools we use to make decisions. Recognizing that doesn't mean ignoring data or research. It means understanding the limits of data and research. It means knowing what your metrics can and can't tell you. It means using judgment and empathy alongside analysis. Coca-Cola had brilliant analysts in 1985. What they lacked was sufficient empathy for the emotional reality of their consumers' relationship with the product. They gained that empathy over 79 painful days, and once they gained it, they never made the same mistake again. That's ultimately what makes the new Coke story valuable. Not as a cautionary tale about corporate stupidity, the people involved were smart and well-intentioned, but as a demonstration that intelligence without empathy is insufficient when dealing with human relationships, even commercial ones. The smartest decision Coca-Cola made wasn't the formula they developed. It was the humility they showed in reversing it. Intelligence told them to change. Empathy told them to change back. Empathy won. And the brand that emerged from those 79 days was stronger, deeper, and more valuable than the one that entered them. Not because they made a brilliant strategic move, but because they made a very human mistake and then made an equally human decision to listen and respond. Sometimes the best business strategy is simply acknowledging when you're wrong and giving people what they're asking for. Coca-Cola learned that the hard way, but they learned it. And that, more than the taste of the formula itself, is why Classic Coke is still on shelves today. Because the company finally understood what they were really selling. Not a beverage, not a taste, not even a brand in the traditional sense. They were selling continuity, memory, and emotional anchoring in a changing world. And when you're selling that, the formula isn't what matters most. What matters is never changing it again. The new Coke case has evolved beyond a business school lesson into a cultural touchstone that keeps revealing new relevance. Every few years, as technology and culture shift, the story gets re-examined through a new lens. In the early days of social media, marketers looked back at New Coke and imagined what would have happened with Twitter and Facebook. The consensus was that the crisis would have been exponentially worse, faster, more virally angry, potentially even more damaging. The fact that Coca-Cola managed the 1985 crisis without internet-speed communication seems almost quaint from a modern perspective. But then something interesting happened. As social media matured and brands began experiencing viral backlash regularly, New Coke started looking less like a cautionary tale and more like a template for crisis response. The key elements, listen, acknowledge, reverse course quickly, be humble, became the playbook for handling modern brand crises. When Gap tried to introduce a new logo in 2010 and faced immediate backlash, they reversed course within a week. When Instagram changed its icon design and interface in 2016, they had to carefully manage user complaints while still implementing the change. When Snapchat redesigned its interface in 2018 and faced massive user resistance, they eventually had to partially reverse the changes. In each case, observers referenced New Coke as either the model for what not to do or the model for how to respond. The story has become particularly relevant in discussions about artificial intelligence and algorithm-driven decision-making. As companies increasingly use AI to make decisions about products and user experiences, New Coke serves as a reminder of what data can't tell you. An AI could have analyzed the taste test data and recommended the formula change. What it couldn't have done is understand the emotional and cultural significance of the original product. Modern tech companies face their own New Coke moments regularly. When YouTube changes its algorithm and creators see their views drop, when Spotify modifies its royalty payment structure, when any platform makes changes that affect millions of users, the fundamental tension is the same. The company has data suggesting the change is beneficial. Users have emotional attachments and habits that make the change feel like a violation. The difference between 1985 and today is the speed and scale of feedback. Coca-Cola took 79 days to reverse course. Modern companies face pressure to respond within hours or days. The call center, receiving 8,000 calls per day, would be overwhelmed by millions of tweets in minutes. The 40,000 letters would be hundreds of thousands of posts, comments, and viral videos. But the fundamental lesson remains. When you build something that becomes part of people's lives and identities, you don't fully own it anymore. Your users or customers become stakeholders in a psychological sense. They feel entitled to have a voice in changes that affect them. Ignoring that sense of ownership is dangerous no matter what century you're operating in. The New Coke story also remains relevant in discussions about American culture and identity. In an era when debates about what America is and should be have become increasingly heated, the story offers an interesting lens. Those 79 days revealed something about what Americans valued in 1985: continuity, tradition, the right to refuse change even when experts told them change was better. Whether those same values apply now, 40 years later, is debatable. American culture has shifted in many ways, but the underlying dynamics, the tension between progress and tradition, between expert opinion and popular sentiment, between corporate power and consumer autonomy, remain active fault lines. Some commentators have noted that the new Coke crisis happened at an interesting moment in American history. The Reagan era emphasized both innovation and nostalgia, both moving forward and making America great again by returning to past values. The Coca-Cola crisis captured that tension perfectly, a company trying to innovate while consumers demanded return to tradition. the story has also evolved in how it's taught in business schools. Early case studies focused on the marketing failure, the flawed research, the misread market. But more recent pedagogical approaches use it to teach emotional intelligence, organizational psychology, and the limits of purely rational decision-making. Some professors use the case to discuss cognitive biases. Coca-Cola executives exhibited confirmation bias, interpreting evidence to support their preferred conclusion. They showed overconfidence, believing their research was more comprehensive than it was. They demonstrated the planning fallacy, underestimating how long it would take consumers to accept change. Others use it to teach stakeholder management. The case illustrates that different stakeholders, consumers, bottlers, shareholders, employees, the media, have different interests and different kinds of power. Managing a crisis requires understanding and addressing all of these stakeholders, not just the ones you think are most important. Still others use it to teach about corporate culture and decision-making structures. How did a company full of smart people make such a significant mistake? The answer involves groupthink, hierarchical decision-making, the silencing of dissenting voices, and the weight of sunk costs. Once Coca-Cola had invested heavily in Project Kansas, it became harder to question the premise, even as warning signs emerged. The case has taken on new relevance in recent years as companies grapple with how to balance data-driven decision-making with human judgment. The trend in business has been toward more data, more testing, more quantitative analysis. New Coke serves as a reminder that this approach, while valuable, has limits. Some things that matter can't be measured by the tools we typically use. Looking back from the perspective of 2026, what's striking is how the fundamental dynamics haven't changed, even as the technology and cultural context have evolved dramatically. People still form emotional attachments to products and brands. They still feel ownership over things that become part of their identity. They still resist changes that feel like violations of implicit contracts. They still organize to protect what they value, though now they organize on social media rather than through phone calls and letters. And companies still struggle with the same basic challenge: how to innovate while respecting what people value about your existing products, how to use data and research without being enslaved by it, how to listen to consumers without being paralyzed by their resistance to change, how to balance confidence in your judgment with humility about what you might be missing. The genius of the new Coke story, the reason it remains relevant 40 years later, is that it's not really about Coca-Cola or soft drinks or the 1980s. It's about the relationship between corporations and culture, between products and identity, between change and continuity. It's about what happens when businesses forget they're dealing with humans who have emotions, memories, and meanings layered over their consumption choices. Every generation of marketers, executives, and entrepreneurs will face their own version of the new Coke moment, the moment when good data leads to a bad decision because something unmeasurable was left out of the analysis. The ones who learn from 1985 will recognize that moment and respond with the humility Coca-Cola eventually showed. The ones who don't will have to learn the same painful lesson over again, because in the end, that's what the story teaches. Intelligence and research and data are necessary but insufficient. You also need empathy. You also need cultural understanding. You also need to recognize that people are more complex than any taste test can measure, and that what they value most is often what they can't articulate until it's threatened. Coca-Cola learned that in 79 days. The question for every company that comes after is, can you learn it from their experience, or will you need 79 days of your own? The answer determines whether you remember the new Coke story as a warning, or whether you become the next chapter in it.